Margaret called at 2:53 on a Saturday afternoon, 3 days after we had put my wife in the ground at Hillcrest Cemetery in Knoxville, Tennessee, on a gray November morning with the kind of cold that settles into the hills and does not move. I was in the den with the television on and the sound off, which is what I had been doing for most of 3 days, because the house had a quality to it that I did not yet know how to be inside of correctly. My daughter-in-law had brought a casserole. My neighbor Roy had shoveled the front walk without being asked. The dog was asleep on the couch where Evelyn used to sit, and I had not moved him. Margaret's name on the screen. Margaret Elaine Whitfield, Evelyn's older sister, 71 years old, retired schoolteacher, the kind of woman who had spent 40 years deciding when to speak and had gotten very good at choosing the right moment. I answered. She said, "Walter, I need to tell you something and I need you to let me finish before you say a word." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "I had coffee with Russell this morning. He told me that Evelyn changed her will in the last week. He told me Daniel gets nothing. He told me she signed the papers while she was in hospice and that the whole distribution has been restructured." A pause. The pause of a woman who believes she is delivering a blow. She said, "Walter, I am so sorry. I don't know what happened between Evelyn and Daniel at the end, or whether she was fully herself when she made that decision, but I want you to know that whatever you need to do next, you do not have to do it alone. There are attorneys who handle situations like this, and—" I said, "Margaret." She stopped. I said, "I know about the will." Silence. The specific silence of someone who drove all the way to the edge of a cliff to warn you about it and found you already standing there, looking down, perfectly calm. She said, "You knew?" I said, "I knew." She said, "How did you?" I said, "Because I was the one who asked Evelyn to change it." What followed was not a short silence. Margaret Whitfield, who had been talking in full, organized sentences since she dialed, had nothing. I could hear her breathing. I could hear, underneath the breathing, the sound of a person dismantling the story they had walked into a conversation carrying. She said finally, "Walter, what does that mean?" I said, "It means Evelyn and I made that decision together. It means I sat with my wife during the last week of her life, and we talked about everything we both knew and everything we both wanted. And at the end of that conversation, she called Russell Haynes, and the papers were drawn and signed. It means the will says what it says, because we both agreed it should say that. Evelyn's name is on it. Evelyn's hand signed it. But the request came from me, and it came from a place we had both already been moving toward for longer than you know." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Daniel doesn't know yet." I said, "No, he doesn't." She said, "What did he do, Walter?" I said, "Margaret, that is a long story, and it is going to take me some time to tell it properly. Come for dinner Tuesday. I'll tell you everything." She came for dinner Tuesday. I told her everything. This is that story. My name is Walter Greer. I am 67 years old. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the house on Sycamore Ridge Road that my wife Evelyn and I bought in 1988 when the dogwoods were blooming, and she said the backyard alone was worth the price, and I said she was probably right. I am a retired structural engineer. I spent 34 years with the same civil engineering firm in Knoxville, the last 11 as senior partner, and I retired in 2020 at 64, 2 years before Evelyn's diagnosis, which was a timing I have since understood as a kind of grace, though it did not feel like grace when it arrived. What I want you to understand, before I tell you what Daniel did, is that this story did not begin in anger. It did not begin in any single moment. It began the way the most important and the most dangerous things begin, which is slowly and in increments, and in a pattern that only becomes visible when you have enough data points to draw the line between them. A structural engineer's professional life is organized around one central discipline, which is the discipline of load and failure. You spend your career understanding how weight is distributed, how stress accumulates, how a structure that looks sound from the outside can be carrying a hidden load that is slowly exceeding the tolerance of the materials. You develop, over 34 years, a sensitivity to the thing that does not match the expected stress pattern, the detail that is absorbing more load than it should, the joint that is working harder than its design accounts for. You learn that catastrophic failures almost never happen suddenly. They happened because of incremental stress that was never caught, never corrected, never documented in the right column of the right report. My job, for 34 years, was to find the deviation before it became the collapse. I had been finding this particular deviation for 19 months before I named it to Evelyn. The yellow legal pad in the desk drawer was the record I kept, in case the documentation ever needed to be produced. Evelyn Ruth Greer, born Evelyn Ruth Whitfield in Asheville, North Carolina, in 1955, was my wife for 39 years and the clearest person I have ever known at close range. She taught high school English at Jefferson High for 28 years, and she brought to that work the same quality she brought to everything in her life, which was the conviction that precision mattered. Not precision as coldness, precision as respect. The belief that the people in front of you deserved the exact truth, delivered with enough care that they could receive it without being destroyed by it. She was warm in the specific way of a woman who has thought carefully about what warmth costs and decided it is always worth paying. But she was not easy to fool. I want to say this plainly, because it is important. Evelyn had the internal accounting system of someone who had spent 28 years reading what students meant underneath what they wrote, and she applied that system to every relationship she had. She noticed things. She held what she noticed. And she chose, deliberately and carefully, when to show you what she had been holding. I had 2 children. Claire was 38, lived outside of Nashville where she worked in hospital administration, and had her mother's accounting system and her mother's careful warmth. She had called every single Sunday for the 2 years of Evelyn's illness without ever being asked, and the calls were never about the estate and never about the finances and never about anything except Evelyn, except what Evelyn needed, except how Evelyn was. She had driven up from Nashville 11 times in 19 months, always with a specific errand as the reason and always staying longer than the errand required. In 39 months of watching her mother decline, Claire had not once, in any conversation I was part of or that Evelyn ever described to me, asked a single question about what would happen to what we had built. Not once. I tell you this because the contrast is not something I manufactured. It is simply who Claire is and who she has always been, without calculation and without performance. Daniel Greer was 42. He lived in Brentwood, which is south of Nashville, in a house he had bought in 2017, where he lived with his wife Sandra and their 2 boys. He was a financial consultant, which I had always understood to mean he was professionally fluent in asset valuation, in the mathematics of future value, in the language of what things are worth and what they will be worth, and under what conditions their worth changes. I had, in retrospect, significantly underweighted this variable when I was trying to understand his orientation toward the question of the estate. He was not a bad person. I want to be precise about that, because this story does not require a villain. Daniel was a person who had, over many years, organized himself around a specific set of priorities, and those priorities had, in the context of his mother's illness, produced a pattern of behavior that was not consistent with the person he presented himself as being. That inconsistency was what I had been documenting. Not cruelty, not open malice. Something quieter and more patient. The behavior of a man who had been running the numbers on a situation and positioning himself favorably within it while performing a different kind of attention for the people watching. The diagnosis came after a routine scan that flagged something in December of 2021 and a follow-up that confirmed the finding in January of 2022. The oncologist at UT Medical Center was thorough and direct, and gave us the information in the careful language of a physician who has learned how to be honest without being brutal. The staging was not favorable. The treatment options were aggressive and uncertain. The timeline was not something she was willing to predict with any specificity. Evelyn received the information in the way she received most hard things, which was by being quiet for 2 days and then deciding what she was going to do. She was the daughter of a Methodist minister from Asheville who had told her at her college graduation that she had been born with more sense than most people acquire in a lifetime, and that he expected her to use it. She used it. She faced the diagnosis and the treatment and everything that followed with the same steady attention she had brought to 39 years of living. She told the children in February. Claire drove up from Nashville that weekend and spent 3 days at the house and cried in the car in the driveway where she thought we couldn't see her, and was steady and practical and present inside the house, which was very much Claire. Daniel came over from Brentwood, which is about 3 hours away, stayed for Sunday dinner, said the right things, and drove home. He began calling more frequently after that. Not every day, but more than he had been. The calls were warm and attentive in the particular way that warmth and attention can be when they are being deployed intentionally rather than offered freely. He visited more. He brought things. He made himself visible in his attentiveness. I noticed the change in frequency without yet attaching a conclusion to it. That is the engineer's discipline. A single data point is not a pattern. You note it and you watch for what develops alongside it. What developed, beginning in March, was a series of conversations. The first was at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon when Evelyn was resting. Daniel sat across from me with his coffee, and he said he had been thinking about the practical side of things, given the situation, and he wanted to make sure Evelyn and I had thought through the estate structure because he had seen situations in his professional experience where families didn't have these conversations early enough and things became complicated. He said he wasn't trying to be morbid. He said he just wanted to make sure we were protected. I said we had an estate attorney and everything was in order, and I appreciated him thinking about it. He said, of course. The conversation moved on. That evening, I went to the desk in the study and I started a new legal pad. I wrote down the date and what he had said as precisely as I could reconstruct it. I wrote it the way I would have written a structural assessment note. Observation only. No interpretation yet. I did not tell Evelyn about the legal pad. The pad grew. In April, Daniel asked about the lake house. We had owned a small property on Norris Lake since 1999, a two-bedroom cabin we had used every summer since the children were young, where every grandchild had learned to swim off the same dock. He framed the question as family planning, as not wanting there to be disagreement later about what Evelyn would have wanted, as honoring her wishes, while she was still able to say what they were. I noted the framing. I noted the date. In May, he asked me, separately, whether the proceeds from my partnership buyout when I retired had been structured into the joint estate or held in a separate account. He said he had a colleague whose family had run into complications with similar funds, and he just wanted to make sure we had thought about the structure. I noted the question. I noted the phrasing. I noted the specific financial fluency of a man who knew exactly which questions to ask and how to dress them as concern. It was Evelyn who first named it between us. I had not yet shown her the legal pad, had not yet told her what I had been noticing, when she sat down across from me at the kitchen table one evening in June with her coffee and said, "Daniel asked me about the lake house again today." She said it the way she said most important things, without preamble, without drama. She looked at me with the expression that had crossed kitchen tables between us for 39 years, and she said, "He's been asking about things." I said, "I know." She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since March." She was quiet. Then she said, "I've been watching it for longer than that." And that was the first time we named it together. We sat at the kitchen table on Sycamore Ridge Road with the spring dark coming through the windows, and we talked for the first time about what we were both watching. Evelyn said, "I believe he loves me. I want to say that clearly, and I want you to know I mean it. But what he is doing does not come from love. It comes from the part of him that has always seen relationships in terms of what they can provide, and right now what I can provide has a timeline on it, and he knows it." She said this without bitterness, without heat. She named it the way she named things in her classroom for 28 years, with the precision of a person who believes the naming matters more than the emotion around it. I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to keep watching, and I want you to keep the record." I kept the record. Summer came, and fall came, and Evelyn's treatment continued, and through all of it, Daniel's attentiveness remained elevated and specific in its direction, which was always, in one form or another, toward the shape of the estate and what it contained. In September, I found something I had not been looking for. Evelyn's financial accounts, our joint brokerage, the retirement accounts, the lake house deed had been searched from a device I did not recognize. I discovered this through the account activity notifications that our financial institution sent by email, which I had set to daily alerts as a general security practice 2 years prior, after a firm I consulted with had experienced a data breach. 3 of the accounts showed login attempts from a device identifier I did not recognize. I noted the device identifier. I contacted the financial institution's security line and asked what information I could access about the login activity. They confirmed the attempts and confirmed they had originated from an IP address registered to a Brentwood, Tennessee residential service account. I sat with that for 10 days. I want to explain the 10 days, because they are not a period of inaction. They are the period during which I did what I had trained myself to do for 34 years, which is to verify the finding before writing it into the report. I cross-checked the dates of the login attempts against Daniel's visits to our house, in case he had used our network during a visit and produced a different registered address. He had not been at our house on any of the 3 dates. I confirmed this against the paper calendar Evelyn kept on the refrigerator and against my own phone records of his visits. I asked Evelyn, without explaining why I was asking, whether she had accessed any of the accounts from a new device. She had not. The finding held. Daniel had been accessing financial account information without authorization, reading balances, reviewing account structures, and examining the lake house deed documentation. He had been doing the math on what we had and how it was held, using access he had not been given. What he did with that information came out through Russell Haynes. Russell is our estate attorney and has been for 16 years. After Evelyn made the decision to revise the documents, Russell recommended, as part of the documentation process, that we assemble a thorough record of the circumstances that had prompted the revision. In the course of that process, Russell identified a pattern of contact that Daniel had made with a colleague of Russell's, a different estate attorney on the other side of Knoxville, beginning in April and continuing through the summer. 5 consultations. The subject, as reconstructed through professional channels, was the structure of a potential estate challenge and the conditions under which an adult child could successfully contest a revision made during a parent's final illness. Daniel had been consulting an attorney about how to challenge Evelyn's will before Evelyn had even signed the revision. He had been preparing the legal position for a contest while sending flowers and making calls and performing attentiveness for the audience in the room. Those 2 facts together, the unauthorized account access and the preemptive legal consultation, were what made the revision not just reasonable, but necessary. Russell's conversation with Evelyn happened in the living room, with Evelyn in the armchair by the east window where she spent most of her time by then, and me on the sofa, and Russell at the coffee table with his files. Evelyn told him everything. Russell listened the way a thorough professional listens, and when she finished, he asked 3 clarifying questions, and then he was quiet, and then he said, "Evelyn, I want to ask you what you want. Not what you think you should want. What you actually want." Evelyn said, "I want to know that what Walter and I built together goes to the people we built it for, and not to the person who has been calculating what it's worth since January." Russell said, "Then let me explain your options." He explained them. Evelyn listened. I listened. When Russell finished, Evelyn looked across the room at me the way she had looked across rooms at me for 39 years, and she said, "Walter, what do you think?" I said, "I think you should do what's right, and I think you've known what's right for longer than this conversation." She said, "I need you to tell me directly, because what I'm considering changes Daniel's distribution entirely, and I need to know you're standing with me on it." I said, "Evelyn, I'm the one asking you to do it." That was the conversation. 4 days later, Evelyn met with Russell and signed the revised documents. 3 days after that, on a Wednesday morning in November, my wife of 39 years died in the armchair by the east window, with the winter light coming through the way she had always said it did in that room, and with Claire beside her and my hand in hers, and the dog asleep at her feet. Daniel arrived within the hour. He was at the reception after the memorial, moving through the rooms of our house with the composed warmth that was his social instrument, accepting condolences, saying the right things. He told me twice that afternoon that he was going to be there for me. He said we would get through it as a family. I said I appreciated it. I looked at his face, and I thought about the account alerts, and the legal consultations, and the Sunday afternoon in March when he had sat at my kitchen table with his coffee and his language of practical planning, and I thought about Evelyn in the armchair with the winter light and her hand in mine. He said he wanted to come by on Monday to start talking through the estate situation. I said Monday was fine. I said to come at 10. He came at 10. He sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and a composed and gentle expression, the expression of a man who has organized himself for a conversation he believes he has been preparing for. He said he wanted to start by saying how much he had loved his mother. He said he wanted to handle everything with the dignity she deserved. He said he had been thinking about what she would have wanted, and he wanted to make sure the estate honored that. I let him finish. Then I said, "Daniel, Russell Haynes is the executor. You'll need to contact his office for anything related to the estate." He said, "Of course, but I just wanted to get a sense of how things are structured, what she intended." I said, "Russell will walk you through what she intended." He called Russell's office at 11. Russell called me at 11:40 to tell me Daniel had called and that the conversation had gone as expected. Daniel called me at noon. He did not use the same voice he had been using. He used the voice underneath that one, the voice that surfaces when the performance is no longer necessary. He said, "Dad, what happened to the will?" I said, "You'll need to talk to Russell about the specifics." He said, "Russell told me I'm not in it. He told me Mom revised the will last week and that I'm completely removed." I said, "I know." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I asked her to do it." The silence on the phone had a specific quality. The quality of a person who has been running calculations on a fixed set of assumptions and has just been told that one of the foundational numbers was wrong the entire time. He said, "You asked your dying wife to cut your own son out of her will." I said, "I sat with your mother in the last week of her life, and we talked about what we both knew and what we both wanted. The decision was hers. The request was mine. Both of those things are true." He said, "What do you think you know?" I said, "Daniel, I know about the account access. I know about the 3 attempts on the joint brokerage and the retirement accounts and the lake house deed from a Brentwood address in September. I know about the 5 consultations with the estate attorney on the other side of town beginning in April. I know about March when you sat at this kitchen table and asked me about the estate structure. I know about May when you asked about the lake house. I know about all of it because I have been keeping a record since March of last year, and your mother knew most of it before I told her the rest." The silence this time was different. Not the silence of calculation, the silence of recognition. He said she knew. I said she knew, and she made her decision with full knowledge of what she knew. I am not going to tell you how to feel about that decision. What I want you to understand is that it was her decision, made with a clear mind, with legal counsel, in full possession of herself. Russell can confirm that. The notary who witnessed the signing can confirm that. The documentation is solid. He said, "I'm going to contest it." I said, "That is your right." Russell can walk you through what contesting it would look like, given the documentation. He did not respond immediately. I could hear him working through it, which is a sound a father recognizes in a son he has known for 42 years. Then he said, "Dad, do you understand what this does to our relationship?" I said, "Daniel, I thought carefully about what your behavior over the last 19 months did to your relationship with your mother. I thought about it carefully and at length. The will is what came from that thinking." He hung up. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at the armchair by the east window, where the winter light came through the way Evelyn had always said it did, and where the dog had already taken up residence the morning after she died, as though he understood it was the right place to keep watch. Evelyn had pointed to that window on the day we looked at this house in 1988 and said the light in the afternoon was the reason she wanted it, and she had been right, and she had been right about most things, and the chair was still there, and the light still came through exactly the way she said it would. Claire came downstairs at noon. She had been staying in her old room since the memorial, being present the way she was always present. She came to the kitchen and sat across from me and looked at me with her mother's eyes, and she said, "He called?" I said, "He called." She said, "How did it go?" I said, "The way it needed to go." She put her hand on the table between us, not reaching, just present, the way people place themselves, sometimes without asking anything of the gesture. Daniel did not contest the will. Russell had been correct that the documentation was as complete as anything his office had produced. And whichever attorney Daniel consulted about the landscape of a challenge had apparently given him the same assessment. He called me in January. Not about the estate. He called because the holidays had passed and because, I believe, the weeks since November had produced in him something that was not quite remorse, but was in the same territory. the understanding of what had been visible and what that visibility had cost. He did not mention the account access. He did not mention the legal consultations. What he said was that he had not been in a good place for a long time, and that he recognized he had not always been operating as the person he wanted to be. He said he understood that his mother had seen things. I said, "She saw everything, Daniel. She always saw everything. She just chose her moment." He said, "Was she angry at me?" I said, "No. Anger was not how she handled the people she loved. She was sad. She was sad about what she had seen, and sad about what she had to choose. And then she made the choice, clearly, and she was at peace with it. That was the most Evelyn thing she ever did." He was quiet. Then he said he wanted to come visit in the spring, if that was all right. I said, "The door is not closed. It has never been closed. What has changed is the arrangement, not the relationship." He said he understood. Margaret came for dinner on Tuesday, 3 days after her call, as I had promised. I told her everything. The legal pad and the account alerts and the attorney consultations and the conversation with Russell in the living room and what Evelyn had said when she looked at me across the room. Margaret listened the way she had always listened, completely, without interruption, the way the Whitfield women had always listened. When I finished, she sat with her water glass for a long moment and looked at the armchair by the east window. She said, "She would have told me eventually." I said, "She would have. She was working her way toward it. She had a way of sequencing things." Margaret said, "I called you because I thought you were blindsided and I wanted you to be ready. I walked in with completely the wrong story." I said, "You walked in with the story you had. I had a different one." She looked at the window again. The afternoon light was doing what it always did in that room. She said, "She asked you to be the one to ask her. That's what I'm understanding." I said, "She had already decided. She needed me to tell her I was with her. She needed it to belong to both of us and not just to her." That was Evelyn. She did not want to carry something that large by herself. Margaret looked at the window for a long moment. Then she said, "She chose right." I said, "She always chose right. She just needed someone standing next to her when she did." The estate is where it belongs. The legal pad and the documentation Russell assembled are in the filing cabinet in the study, in the order they have always been. Claire has copies of everything. The dog sleeps in the armchair by the east window most mornings, which I have decided to allow because Evelyn would have allowed it, and because the chair needed something in it, and because the light still comes through in the afternoon, exactly the way she said it would in 1988, when she stood in that room for the first time and told me this was the house. 39 years is long enough to know a person completely. It is long enough to know, without being told, when a decision needs to be made and what it costs and how to sit beside someone and ask them to make it. Long enough to know that the asking is not a betrayal. The betrayal was the account access and the attorney consultations and the kitchen table questions and the 19 months of patient calculation that preceded all of it. The will was the correction. Evelyn signed it herself, in full clarity, in full peace, with Russell watching and the notary beside him and the winter light coming through the window she chose. She knew exactly what she was signing. She died 4 days later with her hand in mine and Claire beside her and the dog at her feet, and with everything she had built going exactly where she and I had decided it should go. That is the whole story. Every part of it is documented. Every part of it is true. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below and tell me which part hit you the hardest. Hit the like button and subscribe if you are not already here. I will see you in the next one.